Good morning, New York. This is the Jayson Buford Show. I am your host, Jayson Buford. It is a overcast, not too hot, not too cold day in New York. It might drizzle a little bit, but more importantly, we have a great guest, someone I've look up to in this media world and newspaper columnist world, and he's one of my favorite writers of all time. He's somebody that I read daily, like legitimately daily. So it means a lot to me to have him on, Mike Vaccaro.
Jason, after that introduction, I better be equal to those words. I appreciate the introduction. That's very nice of you to say.
Yeah, I've been reading New York Post since I want to say like 12, 13, very young age. In fact, one time I was on the bus reading it, and a woman gave me like money because I was reading it. She was like, "I'm just so impressed that a kid would be reading like it." So,
that's right. That's great. That's great to hear.
Yeah, I was on like the M66 going to school. So it's just wonderful to have you on. But more importantly, you are coming out with a book.
Yep.
It is called, if I'm not mistaken, The Bosses of the Bronx.
That's correct. Yep, it's about the Yankees since January 3rd, 1973. So it's their history under the House of Steinbrenner. Obviously, much of that history was written by George, but subsequently a little bit by Hank, his son, his older son, and obviously the last 15 years by Hal, who's in charge now, and couldn't be more different from his father. But I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit as we go along here. But yeah, it's been an interesting. The Steinbrenner family basically saved the Yankees from oblivion and from leaving New York, and obviously have built it into one of the signature cornerstone sports franchises in all of North America for sure.
When did you start reporting for the book, researching stuff for the book? I find it very interesting because there's a lot of conversations you have with George that are from 2003.
Yeah.
Right. So I
was going to say, really, in a lot of ways, I've been reporting the book my entire professional life in New York City, which really started around 1998 or so. I worked a couple of years at the Newark Star Ledger, and then moved to the Post in 2002. And look, the Yankees are an anchor subject for me. The Yankees, the Mets, the Jets, Giants, Knicks. Those are my bread and butter. And so obviously I've been around the Yankees, close to 30 years. I was lucky enough to be around. I wasn't around during George's apex of craziness, which was the 70s and 80s, but certainly, when I started covering him, he was still very much active, very much George. And I'm glad that I had those encounters with him because they informed a lot of what was in this book. In the short term, I started reporting it about 2 years ago, intensely. But as I said, I'd already accumulated so much in my just travels, my day job, that I was able to incorporate that. And then, a heavy amount of research over the course of 9 or 10 months, and reaching out to people that I've talked to previously about George, and talking to Hal a couple of times. I mean, it's it was actually an enjoyable process because the stories in the book I think speak for themselves. A lot of them are funny, a lot of them aren't so funny. A lot of them, some of the people in there won't find them funny, reliving them again. And I think it's important to remember. Look, I think toward the end, George was considered this avuncular figure. People loved him at the end, and he deserved that because he really did change, I think, in the later years of his life. But it's also important to remember that when he was suspended from baseball the second time, and emphasis on the second time, he was suspended 2 different times from baseball. 30,000 people at Yankee Stadium cheered and chanted, basically good riddance. And I think one of the there are a lot of different great story arcs in this book, and one of them is the redemption of George from just one of the most reviled owners in New York history to one of the most beloved ones. Proof, I think, to any bad New York owner right now, not to name any names, Woody Johnson, that you might be able to have a redemptive arc of your own, depending on if your team, bounces back to win 4 championships in 5 years, as the Yankees did, which kind of helped George's legacy a little bit.
Yeah, he had a unique personality, right? Like, we always talk about this whole deal about, or fans always talk about this idea of, bring back the boss, right? Like, Hal's not the boss. a lot of that stuff, as you write in the book, and also a lot of the stuff, generally speaking, it's not 100% accurate, right? Like, George had his downfall too, but what do you think is something that he had that you do not see current ownership have?
Well, clearly he believed in various iterations of his team that there was no payroll too big to pay as long as they could have a championship team. The only thing that mattered to him were championships. I do think it's important to mention that the economics of baseball have changed drastically from George's heyday. And the example that I'll give is that, the 1977 team, the Reggie Jackson, Don Gullett, team that was called the best team money could buy, their entire payroll was about $4 million. And even if you put that in the inflation calculator and you convert it to $2006, that's still like, $27 million, which is basically what the Yankees are paying Aaron Judge through the end of July, right? In modern dollars. So, in George's time, he would hear a lot from his limited partners, and there were all the jokes about how there was nothing more limiting than being a limited partner for George. And they would complain, we haven't seen a dividend in a couple of years. I mean, what are we getting out of this? And George would be able to joke and say, well, you have very expensive season tickets. That's what you get. That's what you get for being part of the game here. And it's a lot different now for Hal, because you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar operation. And, now you're talking about, when the Juan Soto contract negotiations were going on between them and the Mets, that player wound up, getting a $750 million contract. Mm-hmm. That's not quite so easy to just laugh about with your partners. I mean, you have to answer to your partners. The Yankees are not 100% family owned. They're obviously controlled by the Steinbrenners. The Steinbrenners have been the general partners in one form or another since 1973. So they run the show. But they have to answer to the other people in their partnership, and the partners are usually pretty affable about wanting the same things that the Steinbrenner family wants. But it's not quite as easy as it was when it was George basically just saying, this is who I want, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to get them. It's not quite the same thing, and the economics are such that even George, if George were still alive, would have to at least answer to those limitations that are now, that an operation like, for instance, the Dodgers, which is almost completely run by a trust or kind of corporate structure, don't have to answer to.
Yeah, I mean, this is a family business, right? Like, the Steinbrenner family is just, their business is the Yankees, right? It's not what the Dodgers have. This like a big corporation.
Yeah, nobody's ever going to confuse the Yankees with the Pirates or the Royals, or they're never going to be able to cry poverty as a small market team. Obviously, I mean that goes without saying. But they are, they're even different from what they face across town now with Steve Cohen, who's worth $22 billion in his own right. So he can pretty much do as he chooses to, and nothing's going to really affect him from a financial standpoint. And that's different from what the Steinbrenners have.
Yeah, what I also think is pretty interesting is we do see George in the late 80s buck when he is in battle with Winfield, when he's contesting that Winfield hasn't properly divulged the funds of his
foundation, the Winfield
his foundation. Yeah, exactly. So you see that, right? So you see George also kind of buck when it comes to money stuff as well.
Oh yeah, and look, I mean, that was the cause for the second of his 2 suspensions from baseball, and with cause to a degree. I mean, he probably, he agreed to be permanently banned, which was never going to hold up given the people who were accusing him, but also it wasn't worthy of a permanent lifetime ban, but it was worthy of the 2 years that he was given and that he wound up serving. And look, I mean, when people want to say, I always laugh because, look, I mean, people's memories just they don't extend often as far back as other people's memories. And when people talk about how George would never treat a ball player that way, there have been some things with Aaron Judge in talking about the disrespect, and I'm like, George Steinbrenner literally once blackmailed his best player. That's essentially why he got suspended. I mean, he paid a grifter to try and get dirt on his best player. That's extortion, and that's what he was involved in. I mean, it's not. It doesn't define who George was, but it's certainly an important part of who George was to get a full picture of what the whole Steinbrenner experience was like for the 27 years that he owned the team as the primary face of the operation.
It's so wild to me how scandalous Howard Spira is in your book. Yeah, like I don't think I was prepared for how scandalous he is, right?
Yeah,
like
it's hard to believe that a guy like this could take down George Steinbrenner, and Spira was such a character that he would use that as a calling card for years. I was the guy who got George Steinbrenner thrown out of baseball, and that's the reason why people still talk about Howie Spira, and to Spira's credit, I guess, on the day Steinbrenner died, all these tributes come in from all over the place, and basically Spira said, "You know what? I'm glad he's dead." So, these are the kind of things that George got embroiled in, all throughout his time with the Yankees, and that's what makes it so colorful.
Yeah, he was a character, I think, in a way that Hal can't and knows that he can't measure up to.
Yeah,
right.
And Hal wouldn't be inclined to do it anyway, but it's just not who he is. I mean, Hank, the older son. And I talked to Hank plenty of times when during the brief time he kind of was the face of the operation, and he reminded you of George. I mean, he was impetuous. He had opinions. He was enjoyable company. Hal is exactly the opposite. I didn't know Mrs. Steinbrenner enough to say that he takes after his mother. I just know that he's different from his father, and and that's just and he would tell you that if he tried to act like his father, it would come across as the most phony thing there is, and so he just acts like himself. And his problem because he's so different than his father. Sometimes I think people misinterpret that he doesn't care. Certainly, he doesn't care as much as his father. And as he told me early in my process of writing this project, he said, what did the kids say? Tell me you don't know me without telling me you don't know me. If you think that I don't care about winning baseball games and winning championships, then you just don't know who I am. He just shows it differently. As he will say, my father was about the back pages of the newspaper. I'm more about the back room of the operation and just making sure that things happen and that things run smoothly, and that's ultimately what my responsibility is.
I think in a lot of ways the late 90s dynasty changed people's entire view. I mean, we talked about earlier, changed people's entire view of George, thus now making the view of Hal through the lens of that dynasty.
Well, and yes, on one level, and yet there was also the notion that, look, I mean, Brian Cashman's been on the job for 26 years now. Aaron Boone has been on the job since 2018. Every year the Yankees will go through a tough June or a tough August. And if George was alive, these guys wouldn't have their jobs. Everybody's got to get fired. Everybody's got to get fired. And what people remember from George is him being the guy who went through something like 22 managers in his first 24 years and 14 general managers in his first 24 years. And what people don't talk about is that George died in 2010, right? He hired Brian Cashman in 1998. He hired Joe Torre in 1996. So the last 14 years of his life, he didn't fire anybody.
Yeah.
Or at least not anybody of consequence. So the stability that now sometimes infuriates Yankees fans was really established in the latter days of the Steinbrenner era. Now, mind you, you're not going to fire people when you're winning the World Series every other year. And so that goes along to it. But George had also, I think, realized the error of his ways. And while he never actually said it, he clearly knew that the only reason he was given this late life renaissance of a wonderful dynasty-like team is because while he was sitting out those 2 years, Gene Michael, the GM, was allowed to build a team without interference. And the way Michael did it, heavily relying on analytics and on-base percentage and keeping players that homegrown players and not just, sending them away for today's star of the moment, which was the way George operated for most of the 80s. He didn't do that. And as a result, he built something really special in the Bronx. And, George was ultimately given the credit for it, and deservedly so. He signed the checks. But without his absence for 2 years, Gene Michael probably would have been able to build that. But I think he saw that, later in his days and realized, well, that was probably the best way to do this. And, I'm not sure that he has regrets for the way he operated the team in the 70s and the 80s, but I think knowing what he knew at the end, he might have done things a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think Gene Michael should be considered like one of the most important Yankee figures of, post 1980 era, right? Like that guy legitimately, like what Cashman is doing now, like a lot of that playbook comes from Gene Michael.
It entirely comes from Michael. And in fact, it's funny, Jason, I mean, really, the great irony of the book is that, in the 27 years George owned the team, there were two great championship level eras. And both of them were built in his absence, because during his first suspension from the game, which was a result of illegal contributions to the Nixon campaign, Gabe Paul had the same kind of unimpeded path to building a team that Gene Michael later had. And as a result, they won championships in 77 and 78. And sure, the Reggie acquisition, once George was back involved, was helpful. But it was Gabe Paul who had acquired people like, Dick Tidrow and Chris Chambliss and Greg Nettles and over. And so, and Mickey Rivers and Willie Randolph and Doc Ellis. And he did that when George wasn't interfering. And in the same way, Gene Michael copied that playbook in terms of maximizing the impact he was allowed to have when he didn't have George's constantly, trading away young players for veteran players that just never ever seemed to work out. And that, I think, is the great irony here. But you know what? George is the guy who hired Gabe Paul. George is the one who hired Gene Michael at a time when Gene Michael was out of baseball. He just welcomed him back into the Yankee family and wound up finding a number of jobs for him. And the one that stuck was the GM job, the second time around as GM, by the way. And, it was obviously what would help solidify his legacy for all of it.
I think one of George's skills is finding people, but also, like, if you're someone who's building like a big brand, part of that is having the people you have around you, right?
Yeah.
And I think he knew that stuff. I think he undoubtedly knew that stuff. He undoubtedly knew, okay, how am I gonna build this Yankee brand to what it is? With that help needs to be like people who really know what they're doing, right?
And look, his instincts weren't always wrong either, Jason. I mean, he was the one who pursued, signed, and made Reggie Jackson a Yankee at a time when George felt like he needed, this was his words, he needs somebody to put fannies in the seats. And they had a very key meeting the day after they got swept out of the 1976 World Series, and he gathered his lieutenants, Gabe Paul and Billy Martin and all those people, and said, what do we need to do to make this team take the next step? And they all, they all suggested very sensible choices. Bobby Grich was a free agent who really could have solved a huge need for the Yankees. And Don Gullett, who they ultimately did wind up, picking up, was one. Joe Rudy was a guy that Billy Martin badly wanted, in lieu of Reggie. He thought that Rudy was the better choice because he was a better all-around player, better defender. And George listened, and then he said, well, what about Reggie? And so it was clear that he was the guy going after Reggie. And you can't say he was wrong in making the choice he made, because Reggie led them to 2 world championships and was singularly responsible for the first of them, which ended a 15-year championship drought for the Yankees. So, George did a lot of crazy things. Not all of them were damaging. And in fact, I would argue that in the early part of his time running the Yankees, it was his energy and, his visions that actually helped lead them back to where they had been for so many years in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yeah, but there was 2 things I wanted to say to that. So what I actually thought was pretty interesting was the way he built the brand with the beers, for example. That's like the first move he really makes after he starts owning the team, right? Like, that is the first move he kind of makes to, like, build this brand up. What's interesting is, like, the book kind of ends with Hal ending that with the beers. And that, to me, is a little bit of an acknowledgement of, like, we're in a different world than we used to be in the 70s, right? Like, we're in a different,
Hal kind of rescinded that one also, but I think ultimately we'll probably go back to where these things are allowed. I'm like, and yes, I mean, look, George was a football coach. That if not for his father's heavy influence to get involved in the family shipping business, George would have probably been a football coach. Now, who knows how successful he would have been, but he did coach at 3 different Big Ten schools. I mean, he coached under Lou Saban, who is a borderline Hall of Fame coach who knew good assistants, and George was a very faithful assistant to him. He always had the mindset of a football coach. And look, football is very different than baseball. It's a conversation I have with baseball fans now all the time, because there has been a footballization to both basketball and baseball, I think, where, if in football you lose a game, you spend a week agonizing over it because it's 1 of 17. In baseball, if you did that for all 162, you'll drive yourself insane. But that didn't stop George. He treated every baseball game like a football game. He was more attracted to managers like Billy Martin and Dallas Green than he was to managers like Bill Verdon and Dick Hauser, because those guys were like rah guys, and it could cause some funny things, like when he would try and do like Newt Rockne talks to his baseball team, and they would look at him like he had three heads. But but that was also how he approached every aspect of his life, whether it was when he tried to salvage the shipping business for his father, when he took over the Yankees, when he went to work for the USOC. He brought a Steinbrennerization to the USOC, an urgency to the USOC that I really think helped, certainly in the Winter Olympics, for to help other athletes that maybe weren't getting the kind of support from the Olympics that they otherwise would have. And George insisted on it because he insisted on that kind of urgency. So yes, it comes across sometimes as cartoonish and lampoonish, but it was also somewhat useful in certain aspects as well.
I'm obsessed with like old college football coaches. That's like something weird about me that I'm obsessed about. I just think they have like a unique personality. Like every college basketball coaches are like that too. Like unique type of like personalities, right? Like college sports is about the coaches, and what he reminds me of Woody Hayes a lot, right? Like that type of old school, coach that is like the king of the whole program.
The coach is king, and that's really that was the culture that George came out of. Certainly when he was an assistant coach, and in the Big Ten, that's just the way it is. Any of the Big Ten schools he worked at, I mean, that's the way it's going to be. And so, and mind you, I mean, he ran the Yankees like a football coach. He was the one, even before the nickname Boss, capital B, was coined for him. He referred to himself as the boss. Mm-hmm. And that was done unironically. That was done because that was the persona he wanted to assume, and that was how he chose to run the show.
Do you think he could have run the show like that today?
No,
right?
I don't. I mean, there were a lot of things that were done in those years. Look, people always, especially because Aaron Boone is so laid back and he won't rip his players. And all people want when the Yankees are going through a 7-game losing streak is for Boone to turn into Billy Martin and turn over a table with all the cold cuts.
Sometimes he does that,
and just rip. But he does it away from the prying eye of the public. I mean, maybe we'll find out months later that he got very angry and animated, but he certainly isn't going to go into a press conference and say, my catcher stinks, my right fielder needs to be suspended, we need to trade away my shortstop, which is the kind of thing Billy Martin did. And it was the kind of thing that the fans loved. They ate it up. And you couldn't be Billy Martin in modern sports right now. You just couldn't. I mean, you couldn't act that way, especially when, even in those years, the players made more than the manager did. But now the players are making, literally tens of millions of dollars more than the managers are. There's only so much that investment will hold against the larger investment. And it's the same way with the owner. I think what you see a lot of times now is when owners become too known, you get a Jerry Jones situation. I mean, Jerry Jones, has every right to act as he acts, but I don't think it's necessarily productive for his football team. And I think that's what you would get. One of George's closest friends in life was Al Davis. They looked at life through the same lens. I mean, they were obsessed with winning. I mean, Al Davis couldn't maintain it toward the end, and because it was just a different thing. I think if his son tried to run the Raiders the way Al ran them, I mean, it wouldn't work out. Well, I mean, it's not so great for them now, but you know what I mean. And so I don't think that kind of over the top personality is. I don't think it works. I mean, the best NBA coaches are ones who obviously are able to maximize their players. Chuck Daly had the greatest line of all. He was talking specifically about basketball, but you can take that to any coach and any owner and any general manager in any sport. They allow us to coach them. And, people don't like to hear that, but it's true. I mean, if they choose not to play for you, you're not going to be in the job for long, and you're not going to have a successful ownership if you want to take it a few levels higher on the flow chart.
Yeah, there's a lot of also Billy Martin issues in other stops he was in other than the Yankees as well, which I don't think people really realize, especially in Oakland.
I don't remember that either.
Right,
people tend to remember the good stuff, Jason. That's the reason why I think that so many of these stories of the 70s and 80s for George are going to be like, oh wow, that's right, he did that. Oh my God, he used to argue with the AL president about that. I mean, he used to do stuff like this. Because what we remember is what we had at the end, and that's kind of the way most stories are told. There's always going to be recency bias in everything, and I think there's a recency bias when it comes to George too.
I wanted to bring up Reggie. So Reggie and George had a complicated but very thrilling and interesting relationship, and you write about it in the book a lot. I've heard these things that they had a complicated relationship, but I didn't really know the nitty-gritty of it. I didn't really know the details of it until I read it. And so what I found interesting is at one point Jackson talks about how, hey, I'm the black. He uses the M word. Actually, I'm the black man that they can't hold down, right? Like they can't treat me like a boy. I'm the black man essentially. Which I understand. I would understand. I totally understand Reggie's feelings on that end.
Sure.
As a black man and who Reggie Jackson is, right? I mean, I remember last year he was on Fox and he was talking about all his experiences.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. When in the Negro leagues or even
minor
strolling.
leagues, I mean, he was.
Yeah.
He spent a lot of time in the minor leagues in the South, so he saw it all.
Minor leagues, rather. Yeah.
So he saw everything that you would expect to see in the South in 1967, which is what he did. He saw it. He saw it all.
Yeah. So I think he took a lot of that, as he should, with him. Even when he was on the Yankees, even in a city like New York, right? Like, he took those things, and that's not to say New York doesn't have its issues. Of course it does, right? Like, every state does. So I think is interesting. But Steinbrenner always, or not always rather, but Steinbrenner felt disappointed and disrespected by some of Reggie's words in regards to him. So talk about
Yeah, I mean, after I think the instance you're referring to is right after the famous incident in Fenway Park where Billy Martin went out and benched him in the middle of a game. He went back to his hotel and he was complaining about, I'm not Ruth, I'm not DiMaggio, I'm the black guy in this thing. It's a different way. People treat me differently, and he used the colorful word of the day to describe that. And later on, there was actually a moment when one of the times when George rehired Billy, and obviously he fired him 5 different times. One of the times when Reggie was still there, and Reggie complained about it, and Steinbrenner said, "Boy, stay in your lane," basically. And obviously that's a trigger, and should be a trigger. And here's what I'll say. A lot of African American players who played for Billy, when they talk about Billy, they stop short of saying that he was a racist, because he never quite said the things that you would expect him to say if you thought he was, but there was always the sense that he might, and there was always the understanding of what he believed, and there was always the obvious part that he treated a certain element of player differently than other players.
Griffey talks about that, right?
In George's case, look, he was raised in a lily white environment. He was a child of privilege. Didn't spend a lot of time around African Americans or other minorities in his upbringing, but he was also schooled by his father that there's a certain way to treat everybody. They were both difficult people, but they also George's father believed that that all men should be treated the same way. Obviously, a lot of African Americans who worked for him, and a lot of immigrants who worked for him, and George really did believe that. Look, George was it's a matter of record that George was the first guy to ever hire an African American professional coach with the Cleveland Pipers. John McClendon, who was just a legendary college basketball coach, he gave him a job with the Cleveland Pipers. Now that was only vaguely professional. It was the ABL, but he was paying him to coach white players, and so he did that almost accidentally, and he did often take more credit for it than he probably deserved in making that choice. But it's not like he scotched it. I mean, this guy worked for him. And, I won't say he was a champion of diversity, but he certainly believed in it. And, other than the incidents with Reggie, as you said, I won't say he was hypersensitive. He was just sensitive. He had been through a lot. He'd heard a lot. So his radar was always up. And so...
And Reggie's an intellectual, right? Like, Reggie's a very intellectual person. Exactly. Like, he understands these things. He understands that there's more to it than just...
when Reggie came to the Yankees, he also said, for years, and still says it, that basically George romanced him. I mean, there was no black and white thing with the two of them. I mean, George saw a guy who was a great player, and Reggie saw an opportunity to maximize his stardom, and it was a perfect marriage. So I hate the old when you excuse away people of a certain generation when you say, well, they were men of their times, and I don't think George was. I mean, I don't think George was that. I think it would be unfair both to him and by saying it, minimizing it if it had been a problem. I mean, he was not a guy who really lived much of his life, bordered by racial borders. I mean, he really was as inclusive as the times dictated. I mean, in terms of, he was never going to be considered a groundbreaker, but he was definitely a guy who believed in giving opportunities to everybody. And look, I mean, he hired Bob Watson to be the Yankees general manager, and that was a big deal when it happened.
Yeah.
We tend to look back now because there have been a number of other African Americans given opportunities, but to get that job with the Yankees, and one of George's everlasting regrets also, and he said that to me on a couple of occasions, was that he never gave Elston Howard a chance to manage the Yankees, knowing that Elston wanted the job. He always thought he had more he was going to have more time to make that happen. Elston died very young. And he did not, there were opportunities to hire him that he didn't hire him, but in his heart of hearts, he always figured that would happen at some point. And Elston died, very, very young, so he was never given that opportunity. But so I know that, and I think Reggie, if you asked him right now with truth serum, was George a racist? He would say absolutely not. He might give you a different answer about Billy Martin.
Right. But I mean, yeah, George feels like he's got a guy's guy mentality where if you met up with him and you looked him eye to eye, you can figure something out with him, right? Like you guys can really, really build together if you did that. He's
Look, Ray Negron is a guy who's worked for the Yankees now for over 50 years, and the first time George saw him, he was Ray and his friends were tagging Yankee Stadium, and I think a certain personality might have gone a different way with how you treated him when you caught him dead in the act. And instead of calling the cops, he said, "Look, I want you to come back here tomorrow, and I want to see if we can put you to work." And he did, and all these years later, Ray is still affiliated with the Yankees, and has been just a wonderful ambassador for the team, and really in a lot of ways for George's legacy. So, and I think that tells you that those are the kind of stories that tell you a little bit about who George really was when it came to that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people, you also have this in the book. When it comes to the Mets were the hip team after a certain point in the 60s and in the 80s. But I also think a lot of people, they misunderstand what the Yankees are. It's not that the Yankees are racist or contain racism. It's more just like it's a corporate power structure, but the Yankees
Exactly
more.
right. Very,
you know what I mean?
It was
Yeah,
it was Red Smith in the 50s said, coined the great line that rooting for the Yankees is like rooting for U.S. Steel. And it was because they won every year the way U.S. Steel does, but also it was like rooting for the phone company. Who roots for the phone company?
Right.
And if you're a Yankee fan, you take that as an insult, and you should take it as an insult. But if you don't root for the Yankees, and one of the great things about the Yankees or the Cowboys or the Lakers or the Celtics is that you have just as many people who passionately despise them as passionately adore them, and that's what makes them so important.
Yeah, I mean, I take it as an insult because yes, we have Mickey Mantle, but we also have Reggie Jackson. Yes, we have Derek Jeter, but we also have Jazz Chisholm, right? I think there's always more to the Yankees than just the main stars that you see 100%. Painted on the murals and stuff like that, right? I think there's always been more to the Yankees than just that.
That's very fair. Yep.
So yeah. So that's always what I tend to say, and I do understand. You even have in the book stuff about possibilities of them moving to New Jersey, but it never happened because they live in the Bronx, right? Yankee Stadium is in the Bronx, right? And I think that's an important part of the organization.
Absolutely, yeah. And look, I mean, I think that the step in the right direction, to give credit where it's due, was we shouldn't forget Michael Burke, who's a important character in the early part of the book. He was the CBS representative when CBS owned the team. They were not successful. They lost a lot of business. He's blamed for a lot of that, and deservedly so on one level. But he was also, he saw what the Mets were doing, and more to the point, I mean, his worldview was such that, he wanted to make the Yankees more diverse. He wanted to make the fan group younger, and he wanted to appeal to more people than I think. I think the Mets had figured that out a lot, long before they did. Burke was the reason why they caught up, but Steinbrenner was really the guy who, and obviously, again, it helped that under Steinbrenner they started winning again. and that's the ultimate solve for salve for any operation in professional sports. That's for sure.
Yeah, I going back to Reggie, one of the things that he reminded me of, he actually reminded me of Juan Soto a little bit, right? Like that type of like swagger and that type of like straw that stirs your drink energy that he had. It reminded me of watching Soto in 2024.
Yeah, and as great as Reggie was, I mean, there were a lot of people who would point out his deficiencies first before, he's also a great home run hitter. I think a lot of people like that with Soto too. They want to say, well, you had only 280 last year. How great is that? $750 million for that. Not a great fielder. Sometimes doesn't go, running into fences, so forth, that kind of thing, running out ground balls. I mean, so you're right. I think it's a very fair comparison to Reggie in his time and Soto in his.
I can't, say this for sure, but I would say that if we had Soto last year, and I think Bellinger's a really good player, but if we had Soto last year, I think that, that series against Toronto goes to 5. There's just something that guy has.
Yeah.
That I think they missed a little bit.
It was hard to tell because Judge had such a great year last year. But, there was a long stretch of 2024 where you started to wonder, are Soto Judge like the greatest 1-2 punch since Ruth and Gehrig? And really the Yankees are the only team that can actually have a point of comparison like that. But to have that point of comparison is almost absurd, and you'd have thought it absurd, even if you were talking about Mantle and Maris or, Thurman and Reggie. I mean, nobody would ever say that they were Ruth and Gehrig, and yet it made sense for 3 months of that year to say, are these guys like in that league? Because that's what they were capable of. So I think I tend to agree with you on that.
Yeah. Another really interesting thing is the way George was suspended in 1989. What it actually reminded me of was when they suspended A-Rod in 2014, because it was under similar like sketchy vibes when it comes to baseball. Like the way they got George was a pretty sketchy way. Yeah. I think if I recall correctly, Faye Vincent, he had to go under. It was under a wiretap or something like that. The way he found.
He basically denied Steinbrenner's due process, and the commissioner's office in those days was still so unquestionably powerful that no one ever questioned it until they took a harder look at it, and then they realized that, well, George wasn't blameless in this, and he probably deserved to be penalized for what he'd done. The whole process was worse than the crimes that George had committed. And that ultimately came out.
And I think that's similar to A-Rod in a way where, they lose Tony Bosch and, Tony Bosch is sketchy and it's like, they're paying Tony Bosch under the table for this information and all that stuff, although A-Rod made his mistakes.
Look, I mean, I do think that Alex behaved badly, but I think it's interesting that he wound up with his reputation in tatters and he's never going to get in the Hall of Fame probably. I voted for him this year, but I just don't think he's ever going to get there. And I just think, the veterans committees tend to be harder graders than we as writers are. So I don't think he's ever going to get in. And yet, Bud Selig is in the Hall of Fame. And, Bud Selig is the guy who turned a blind eye to steroids for a lot of years. He could have fixed this a lot earlier than he did. He only did it basically at the point of a gun before, Congress was going to start hurting baseball in real tangible ways. That's when he finally realized he had a problem and tried to solve it. And, basically, A-Rod was the cudgel he used and the example that came out of it. I mean, there are other ball players who've had to pay the consequence, but none like A-Rod because nobody was as good as A-Rod.
Right.
And, maybe Barry Bonds you could argue, but the fact is that, it's to Alex's credit that he's back involved in baseball in a huge way every October, is still a voice of the sport. And, it became Bud Selig's mission toward the end to rid the sport of this guy when his hands weren't entirely clean either.
Yeah.
I think that's a very fair comparison with Steinbrenner and Faye Vincent.
Yeah. I mean, Bonds got lucky in that when he was allegedly using, that stuff is before the testing. It's before a lot. Yeah, right. It's before the report. It's before all the tests. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think, this is a whole different podcast, Jason, but, you could argue about, has Bonds and Clemens also been treated, fairly or unfairly. We have fairly anecdotal evidence that both those guys started on a certain date, and both of them had already accomplished so much that if they had just had an injury instead of gone on, taking PEDs, that would have been enough to probably get them in the Hall of Fame. And yet they had the second half of their career that were tainted by the performance-enhancing drugs at a time when, thanks to Bud Selig, those weren't considered. I mean, they might have been against the law, in a court of law, but they weren't in the sport of baseball. And that's something that Bud Selig has never really answered to. And, in the broader picture, will always have to answer for, even though he may never have to do it on the record.
Rocket was my first favorite pitcher. I mean, he was like John Wayne. He was so interesting and
really good too. Man.
Yeah, he was really, really good. Yeah, he was like my first favorite pitcher. I find him really fascinating and very funny. He in a lot of ways, I don't think people realize like how rough of a childhood Roger Clemens had too. Sure. You know what I mean? Like, that's not a guy. Yeah, and Bonds at the same level too. Even though Bonds' father was in. Also, what I love is Bonds' dad is also in this book. Bonds is also in this book from 93. So that
Yep.
I thought that was pretty cool. But those guys had like profoundly unhappy childhoods in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
and so I could see why they became who they became, both greatness and some of the mistakes that they have supposedly made.
Also very fair. Yep.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I mean, I really enjoyed this book. Yankees 2026. What's the vibe going in? You think? I like them, honestly. Like I think they're going to be a good team again. I think they're going to win 95, 96 games again. Look, as long as Judge stays healthy, I think they have a good chance of winning the division. And also, I think Bellinger's going to be good. I think Stan's going to be good. I think Jazz is going to have a big year. It's a contract year for Chisholm. I think he's going to have a big year. What are your thoughts on the 2026
I've had to
Yankees?
laugh when people were like, in derision, were saying, well, they're just going to run it back. Well, you're running back a team that won 94 games last year. That's a pretty good idea, I think.
Yeah. Without some of the best, without Cole, who's one of the best pitchers,
right.
I think.
And that's the other thing, Jason, is that you mentioned all the terrific hitters, but they really do have a chance come July, if all things go properly, everybody comes back, and everybody performs to a certain level. They have a chance to have maybe the best rotation in the sport, at a time when that's not an easy thing to acquire and assemble. And you think about by July, by August, you could be talking about Cole, Rodon, Schlittler, Max Fried, and then you can. That's as good as anybody can put together. Certainly in a 7-game series when those are the 4 guys that are going to get the ball. And and if Luis Gil can come back to where he was 2 years ago, you're talking about a legit 5-guy rotation. Day after day after day, that's going to be hard to have a losing streak when you have that kind of pitching every day. And that's going to be the kind of, and if those guys can stay healthy, upright, and pitch well, that's what gives you a leg up when you come into a short series. And those are the only guys you're going to be facing. And the guy like Heel can go into the bullpen maybe, and that kind of thing, and strengthens the bullpen just by his presence there. So I think they'll be good. I think they're obviously going to be a playoff team. And then it's like anything else. People hate it when, and the funny thing is, we did a story about this in the Post a few weeks ago, which was something I kind of realized in the course of my research. Everybody accuses Brian Cashman of using the word crapshoot when it comes to playoffs, and I can say with certainty that Brian Cashman has never uttered that word in his life, and I think he did it because other people around him, like Joe Torre, used to say it a lot, and he got a lot of crap for saying crapshoot a lot. I don't think Cashman likes the word. He's the one who's given that word for whatever reason. Even Hal likes to say, well, as Brian likes to say, it's a crapshoot. Well, Brian's actually never said it's a crapshoot. But the fact is, it is a crapshoot. It is. It was a crapshoot for the Blue Jays, and they almost rolled 7s all the way to the World Series and winning the World Series. They were in the World Series, obviously. They should have won it. And that's that. Crapshoots aren't always bad. Crapshoots sometimes you hit the dice, and that's what the Blue Jays did. So, and it is because baseball is different. Baseball is just different than any other sport. Football, if you're a really good team, you're playing at home, you're probably going to win a big game. The same thing with basketball. It's not 100%, but the advantages are just inherent in the nature of the game, right? You get handcuffed by a good pitcher. All of a sudden, you're behind the series. Things happen. That's why it really is a crapshoot in baseball. So once you get to October, anything is possible. But I think they'll get to October. I think they'll get there, a little more comfortably than they did last year. Not they didn't had to struggle getting in the playoffs, but I don't think they're they had to go through the Red Sox. That was a hard series, and the Blue Jays are waiting for them. And by rights, if one game goes differently, they wind up with the home field there. Maybe the entire series is different. So, I think I do think those are things to consider.
I think the Blue Jays had players that played out of their minds too. Not even counting not counting Vlad Jr., who I think is an amazing player, who I think is going to be a thorn in the Yankees side for many years. Right? Like I think he's like
Ortiz. He'll do so with play and gusto.
Yeah, he will. Yeah, I mean, he reminds me of like Ramirez, Ortiz, that type of level of oppositional talent. But they did, I think, have a lot of guys play out of their minds. Clement. Addison, Garvey, like some of those other guys I thought played really well.
I agree with you on that. For sure.
But it's I think when fans hear the word crapshoot, they think, oh, they're just like, they're giving everything to the mathematics, and
I think Brian realizes that's the reason why he doesn't use it. I mean, he's not the one who initiated this. We actually went to him and said, we've never seen a situation where you said the word crapshoot. He's like, well, it's because I've never said it, because I don't like the word. I mean, it's just I understand why the word is used, but it's not. It sounds like a cop out, is what it sounds like, and I think that Brian realizes that, which is why he doesn't use it. And I think it is a cop out. Look, I mean, sure, I mean, it's the World Series in 2024 was a crapshoot too. And the emphasis on the crap with the fifth inning of the fifth game, right? I mean, it's not necessarily a crapshoot when you play an inning that poorly, which winds up costing you your season. So it's not, so it's not fair to say everything about October is a crapshoot. Sometimes you got to play good, and that's what the Dodgers did against the Yankees certainly in the World Series, and what they did when it really mattered against the Blue Jays. I mean, they were outplayed in that series, start to finish, and wound up with a parade out of it because they know how to win, and that's what baseball is. It's figuring out how to win important games when you have no other option but to win them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Dodgers are really good defensively in a way that I think the Yankees sometimes can struggle with. The play can be a little
struggle fundamentals still, and that'll drive them crazy when you mention it to them. And I get it because no one wants to be told that you don't have all your P's and Q's wrapped up. But I mean, it's a fact of life, and it's a fact of truth when you look at how they play.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Transition. Let's talk about the New York Knickerbockers in the second half of the year, going into the second half of the year now. I think you have some of the best Knick coverage. I think on the media sphere online, you follow the team very, very closely.
I appreciate it. We have a nice team. I mean, Steph Bonnie does a great job. Jared Schwartz does a terrific job. And I just like to help out where I can. But look, I mean, I went a lot of years in this town working for this newspaper where the Knicks were just an afterthought by now, and worse. And so I just embrace the idea that people care about it, and so you want to be equal to what people care about, and they really do care about the Knicks right now.
Yeah, there was someone had made a tweet talking about they were frustrated with something in relation to management with Leon Rose. I forgot exactly what it was. And somebody was just like, Brett, I had to go through Stephon Marbury and Isaiah Thomas sniping at each other through the press.
I noticed the thing behind you.
Yeah,
you don't have to answer for your credibility as a Knicks fan because you've been through some dark times. And look, but I also go back to the '90s, Jason, and this is probably a little before your time, but I mean, people never believe me when I tell them. You talk about the mid-'90s Knicks. I mean, this is after the Yankees started winning championships, and in what's supposed to be like a huge baseball town. But in the mid-'90s, late '90s, baseball season didn't begin in New York until the day after the Knicks were eliminated from the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And I kind of felt that way the last 2 years with the Knicks. 2 years ago was May, and last year was early June, and that's when you started to change your taste to baseball because when the Knicks are good, when the Knicks have a shot, there's really nothing better in New York than them because they bring so much history and so much baggage and so much other stuff to it, and because New York is such a inherently basketball town. I mean, the tradition of basketball in New York is unrivaled in just about anywhere else in the country, And that comes to the fore. I mean, we saw what it was like in Manhattan last year. Manhattan in May and, during the Pacers series after they beat the Celtics, it was like Tuscaloosa North. It was like a college town. They were changing the street names to the players' names. I mean, this, you just don't see that in cosmopolitan New York, but that tells you how much basketball means, and specifically how much the Knicks mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Knicks are every identity group's meeting point in New York.
Yeah.
Right.
And plus, they play their games in Manhattan, and that matters. It just does. I mean, all due respect to every place else, I live in North Jersey. I love North Jersey, but it's not Manhattan. Manhattan is where the Knicks play, and that makes them a big deal just because of that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is legitimately like every group they meet at Knicks fandom, right? Yep. And so I think I think that's what makes it so unique. Look, the team now that Giannis and those rumors are past us, I think you'll see how they look in the second half, particularly how Cat looks, who I think is the most important player on the team, right? I think if Cat is really, really right, they really got a chance to beat anybody.
And he's a perfect number 2. I think he'd be in trouble if he was the guy that you're relying on to be your guy down the stretch. He's clearly not that guy. That's clearly Jaylen, right? I mean, so you don't have to worry about Cat being the guy who's going to deliver you. But because in addition to the fact that sometimes he's, he just doesn't have the impact you want a guy of that level to have. He also does he has some brain cramps where that'll drive you nuts and will kill you in a playoff series. We saw the whole silliness of the All-Star game. Wemby got all mad at him because he sloughed off the 3 when a 3 was the only way they could lose. That's the kind of thing Cat does. But if it happens in the third quarter, you can kind of not obsess about it. So as a number 2, and look, I do think I've seen better things of him lately. I do think that he's more committed to being an interior presence and not just relying on the 3, which is ironic because he shot the ball of the 3 so well in the All-Star game, but that's beside the point. But look, I mean, Jaylen is the guy who controls the engine, and Cass is one of an array of guys. I mean, look, when OG is healthy, he's an incredible weapon because he does everything on the other side of the floor. I know Mikal Bridges is always going to get his share of criticism because of what it took to bring him here. But I think he's terrific, and the fact is that he's a guy who's as committed to the defensive end of the floor as the offensive end of the floor, and I think that he really serves as a wonderful spokesman for the team. I mean, when he talked a couple of weeks ago about how, I don't think I was being as accountable as I should be or as coachable as I should be, you don't just hear that from professional athletes every day. And I think that kind of represents a lot of what the Knicks ethos is, and I think that's why. And look, Josh Hart, there's literally nothing bad to say about Josh Hart except that he occasionally is a little sloppy with the ball. I can live with that. I'm sure you probably can too. Mm-hmm. So you go on, and I think here's the thing with them, Jason. They have to be healthy, and I think that's the thing. It's interesting. I know the thing that drives people crazy about this team is the inconsistency, and man, was it ever better underlined in the last 3 games they played. They were brilliant at Boston. Stomped the Celtics in Boston, and 2 games later just eviscerated the Sixers in Philly. Then they lost at home to the Pacers. Mm-hmm. Now I think you, me, and 3 guys off the street could probably beat the Knicks if we wore Pacers uniforms because I think the Pacers are that far in their head. But I get it. Like the Pacers aren't good this year. They won 10 games before that, 3 on the road, and they won that game. So
they're the type of team that would legitimately get up for the Knicks game, right?
Which is one thing the Knicks. Look, I mean, everybody talks about how I get it. People probably try and get their A game when they play the Thunder this year too. But you're playing those games in Oklahoma City. All due respect to the fair people of Oklahoma City, it's not like coming into Manhattan and playing on Broadway. It's just not. People are different. It's interesting how players tend to be healthier when they have a 2-game stretch against the Knicks and the Nets. They tend to be a lot healthier than they are against the Nets. And, same thing that happened with the Pacers. 4 of their guys who played against the Knicks didn't play against the Nets, and that's just how it is. And that's fine. That's part of being the big dog in town, I guess. But, look, it's if you can stay healthy, if the guys, if Deuce comes back, you have 10 legit guys now. And Mike Brown has shown a willingness to play those guys and integrate them. If one guy's not playing well, if Cat's not playing well, he won't play in the fourth quarter. Bridges, all those guys. I mean, you have 10 guys. The emergence of Shamet has been huge because this is a reliable shooter now who also plays defense, and they just tend to play a lot better with him. When Deuce comes back, that makes it 10 deep. The Alvarado addition has been enormous already for 3 games. I think a lot of us were hoping they would be able to make that deal because he's brought exactly what we thought he would bring, which is, for lack of a better term, that New York grit and annoyability that gets under people's skin, but actually, makes the fans already love him. They've only played one home game, they lost it, but they know enough that this is a guy they're going to want to root for. I would argue that as good as the Pistons are, I think 1 to 10, again, assuming full health, I think the Knicks have the best 1 to 10 in the East. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to beat the Pistons. And unfortunately, the Knicks play the Pistons tomorrow night, which should be a really huge game to watch. And the Pistons are going to be missing, their two big guys because of the suspensions. So that'll make all three games where neither team was at full strength. I think Jalen was out for the first Pistons game. I think OG has missed both Pistons games. So Cat didn't play the second Pistons game. So, but you really, how much can you tell from the regular season, Jason? Right? Last year the Knicks were 1-7 against the Pistons and the Celtics in the regular season, and they beat both teams in the playoffs in 6 games. So,
yeah, you never know. The Pistons look great this year.
They are great, and
they
play. They play hard. They play really. They play really well together. They care about winning. You don't see that a lot of young teams that right away, really, are just compete every night. They want to win every night. Mm-hmm. And I really like that about them. I mean, I think if you're any team in the East, you'd like to avoid them till the finals if possible to see if someone else can take them out or whatnot. But, whatever. I mean, the Knicks have beaten them in the playoffs, though. And it's basically the same team. Some differences, but it's basically the same team. So that would be a fun series to cover, that's for sure. There'd be a couple of skirmishes, I would think, and a couple of warnings to stay on the bench.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would be particularly worried about our backcourt defense against Kate Cunningham. Like, that is, I think, the biggest matchup, right? It's the biggest match. Like, Brunson versus Cunningham is the biggest matchup, I think, in that series. Yeah. Just, that's cliche to say because they're the two best players, but I genuinely just think that is the matchup.
I think where the Knicks have an advantage along a lot of nights is they get an advantage from that spot. Jalen's going to be 90% of the time is going to get the check mark every time. I think Brunson is every bit the player that Cunningham is. I think they're interchangeable. I think that's a dead heat. Mm-hmm. So neither team gets an advantage from the point guard spot, where both of them usually get a huge advantage from the point guard spot. And so that's probably where it's going to matter more, that Cat's more engaged and playing better, and OG and Bridges and then on, and Hart and those guys. So I think that's the biggest issue for the Knicks, is that you're not going to have an obvious advantage at that position, but you're used to having an advantage almost every game you play.
Do you have any predictions for where they end up?
I think they're. I again, this is presuming that you don't lose 2 key starters for 10 games at a time. But I think they have 27 games left. I mean, I think that it's reasonable to ask them to go 2 for 1 for every game. So 18-9, is that fair? That gets them to, I think, 53 wins, 53 wins. I think 18-9 would do that. I think that would get them the 2 seed. Maybe it would be the 3 seed. It'll be interesting to see what happens to Boston when Tatum comes back. I mean, I think that could go either way. They could be even better and could be kind of, reminiscent of what they were last year, or it could be kind of a chemistry issue. It'll be fun to watch. It's certainly fun for the Celtics fans.
Yeah.
But I think it's reasonable to think they can compete for the 2. I think the Pistons they're 5 games up. I think 6 games up. That's a lot to make up in 27 games. I don't think the Pistons are going to help you. The Pistons aren't going to go 6-20 in the last 26 games. They're not. So, you're going to have to do it on your own. And I don't think the Knicks are going to go, 25-2. They still got 2 games against the Thunder. They still got 2 games against the Rockets. They got plenty of hard games mixed among the dregs. But this is the time of year when good teams tend to beef their record up, because now teams have really kind of given up the ghost, and you're going to play a number of teams that you still get to go to Utah that's desperately trying to lose. That would normally be a fairly tough game. You still got the Clippers ahead of you. That's a game that normally would have been tough. Now it's like, well, unless Kawhi goes nuts, that's a game you probably should win to. So your schedule is different in the last month and a half of the season than it is the rest of the season, which is, something the NBA probably has to work on. So, but I do think, look, the Knicks do have stack wins. They need to get to a place. You definitely don't want to get in the 4-5 situation where you're going to have a really hard game to start, and then of course you're staring at the Pistons in round 2. I think.
Yeah, I would love to avoid the Cavaliers in the first round.
Look,
The
thing of it is not just the Celtics. I mean, the Cavaliers are legit now. I think Harden has been a great addition to them. They've been playing as good as anybody in the league the last 3 weeks. So, it's going to be hard to stay out of the 4. I mean, because you have those two teams, and obviously the Cavaliers and the Celtics were the bane of the Knicks' existence last regular season too, and now you add the Pistons. But I think they could and probably should get to the 2. I think at the worst you want to be 3, and then you deal with it from there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think?
I'm gonna go 2.
I think that's fair.
I'm gonna go 2.
I think it's a reasonable goal. All of us thought the Knicks should be the conference, the NBA finalists this year. So we all expected them to be, in play for the 1. I don't think any of us expected the Pistons to be this good and to kind of separate themselves. So, but I think 2 is an absolutely reasonable goal. I think it really is, and I think it's achievable, which is more to the point.
Yeah, I am a little worried about the loss of Deuce, especially the shooting.
Yeah.
Especially the shooting. Like Alvarado, I think has put a lot of energy and a lot of, he's a little bit of a guy that I think they miss sometimes, right? Like Jalen's not going to get in your face. OG's not going to get in your face, but Alvarado will. And so will Jeremy Showen, by the way. I also think he'll also.
Yeah, we didn't mention him at all. You're right.
Yeah.
Look, I think one of the low points for the Knicks, because they weren't just in a 2-9 stretch when it happened, but when it was out in San Francisco when Draymond tripped up Cat, and not only wasn't there a response to it, but guys were throwing hugs his way after the game, and that wouldn't happen now if Alvarado was on the floor. I can guarantee you that.
Yeah,
there would be no hugs.
And I know there was something going on with Cat and a lot of the rumors, and I understand there was a lot of that happening, and
sure.
And I get that can bleed into the players and et cetera, and he was slouching a little bit. I get it. But I also felt that was not what I saw last year and not what I saw 2 years ago. And, it's just, there's no way Draymond Green should be able to do that to a teammate. And, it's all hugs and he gets away with it afterwards.
And look,
right?
Jalen didn't play that game. I think he might have treated that a little bit differently. I don't even think he was at the arena that night, so it wasn't even like there could be any repercussions afterward. Hart was just coming back from his ankle thing. I think he was still trying to figure other stuff out, so he wasn't necessarily as engaged as he normally is. So maybe there were a lot of, there was maybe a perfect storm, and of course there was no Alvarado there, which would have really caused a problem for Draymond. But I do get a sense being around them, and of course nobody's been around anybody for the last week. It's been a very long break for the season, but I really got. I get it. The Sixers didn't have Embiid when they played him and beat him by 49 points or whatever it was. But I liked what I saw in that game. I saw a little feistiness which has been missing, and I think they had a little bug in their bonnet because of losing to the Pacers the day before. And I think that was kind of sometimes we give too much importance to things like wake up calls. But I do think that that got their attention. Like, what, we really can't just phone it in against anybody. We can't. We have to play well in order to win games. And if they just played okay, they would have beaten the Pacers by 10 that night. But they were terrible. And and as it was, they almost stole the game. Almost stole the game again.
Yeah.
And possibly in overtime. And I think that was kind of a reminder to them that they're just not. They're very good, but they're not good enough to just phone it in, for games at a time and expect the results to be there.
Yeah. One last thing, very, very quickly. Eli didn't make it to the Hall of Fame again. What's your stance on Eli in the Hall of Fame? I'm not. I don't know what your stance is on that. If you had one,
I think Eli's a Hall of Famer. I don't think it should diminish his legacy or his accomplishments, one bit. If he's not, an immediate Hall of Famer. I know that a lot, certainly when it comes to baseball, and I'm a baseball voter, so I do take this stuff seriously about the difference between a first ballot Hall of Famer and a regular Hall of Famer. I think there are some people now are calling for they want strata, like pyramids in the Hall of Fame, where you got Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig here, and you have on a lower level you have Willie Mays, and on a lower level you have guys like Ichiro, whatever.
If you make it, you make it. I think.
To me, a Hall of Famer is a Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
And and the way that in baseball we distinguish were you a first timer or not. In Mariano's case, were you unanimous or not? He's the only guy who's ever done that. I think there's no question that if you look at Eli's career objectively, he is a Hall of Famer. I get it. Sometimes some people want to take points away, deduct points because he didn't have great seasons in between the championship seasons, but you know what? He had those championship seasons, and he was the best player on the field for those two teams. and he was the most responsible guy on the team for those 2 wins. And he was a Hall of Fame level player. There are a lot lesser quarterbacks than him in the Hall of Fame who don't have the trophies to show for it. He'll get in eventually. That voting system is so Byzantine and weird that I can't really explain why guys get in, why they don't get in. But I do think eventually he'll get in. He should. And if they don't, then then they should redo the vote, because if a guy like Eli Manning can't get in the Hall of Fame, in his 3rd or 4th or 5th year of eligibility, there's something wrong. And it's not the same situation. Everybody knows that Bill Belichick's going to be in the Hall of Fame, and everybody knows, even if nobody wants to put their name to it, that there were circumstances that kept people from voting for him. And whether you can defend those circumstances or not, that's what happened. That's not the case with Eli, and I think it's just a matter of, I do think that because we saw him play every week around here, maybe we do overrate him a little bit. I'm not saying he's overrated. I'm saying we overrate him more from like what his standard opinion of his play would be. But I do think that if you didn't watch him every week, you tend to grossly underrate him too. And I think at some point those two places will meet, and that's when he'll get in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, he is, when I mean like a New York sports legend, Eli Manning is like such a New York sports just hero.
Yeah. Look, people. I like him a little bit, and look, he was a better player, but Jeter was a surefire first ballot Hall of Famer. But there are still people who are going to tell you that he's a product of the New York hype machine. He had 3,600 hits. No, he wasn't. But I understand there are still people who believe that if Derek Jeter played his career in Kansas City, he wouldn't be looked at the same way. And maybe that's true, because he wouldn't have played on the same kind of teams. And part of Jeter's resume is how great he was in October. But I do think that sometimes, for all the advantages you get for playing in New York, I do think that sometimes there were certain athletes. Patrick Ewing's another one I can throw into that mix, and Carmelo is another one I can throw into that mix. And there were others. I think sometimes they wind up being undervalued because they played in New York, and people assume that their legacies were overblown when I don't think they were.
Yeah, Jeter made plays.
You're giving us way too much credit, Jason. I'd love to say that I was responsible for all the good things that happened to Derek Jeter, because then I'd ask Derek for a few of the good things that he's had. Maybe he could share those with me, but I'm not responsible for that, and nor any of my brethren in the media. We're not the ones who made Eli Manning great, and we're not the ones who made Derek Jeter great.
Of course.
Just,
Jeter
we just wrote about it.
Jeter made plays. I'm sorry. Jeter made plays.
No,
and
it's an absurd.
You can say what you want about defensive numbers and all that stuff. Jeter made plays. You can say what you want about Eli. Eli made plays. Look, I think that Roethlisberger is someone who I view Roethlisberger as a little overrated. Roethlisberger is going to get in, I think.
Sure.
Who's better, Eli or Roethlisberger? That's a tough debate. It's a pretty,
if
for
Phillip
me.
Rivers gets in before Eli, then something's wrong.
I
think that's when you start wondering about injustice. Right now, if it's just a matter of having to wait longer than maybe he should have to wait, I don't think that's an injustice so much as an inconvenience. But, when you start putting in lesser players, that's when I'm going to start, clearing my throat and say, what's going on here?
Did you vote for Andrew Jones?
I did.
Yes, okay.
Yep.
Yeah. I was very happy to see him get it.
I don't think I voted for him every year he was on the ballot, but he went from whatever he went from to 76%. So I was among those who, after and I take my ballot seriously, in that I think what's one of the good things about having a guy on the ballot for 10 years. It was better when it was 15, but to have it on for 10, you can reaccount for his career every year, and make adjustments as you see fit. And I think that's I think that's the best way to vote. Look, those of us who vote for the Baseball Hall of Fame, we hear it every year that we stink at our jobs and we don't know what we're doing. And I get it. That goes with the territory. But I still think that that's the best way to do it, because we don't come with a lot of real agendas. And I think that most people who to vote for baseball, you got to cover baseball for 10 years, and you have to cover a minimum amount of games. I mean, people who vote for the writers who vote for the Baseball Hall of Fame know what they're saying. They may not always be right. I'm not saying that. I disagree with people's ballots all the time. But I do think that that's the best system that we have. I don't like the football system. I can't even tell you what the systems are for the NHL or the NBA. I know I'm not involved in them. But I do think it's the best way. And there isn't a perfect way out there, but this is the best in an imperfect thing.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a sincere pleasure. It was wonderful, and thank you for coming on.
Jason, it's a lot of fun. It was great talking to you. You know your stuff, my man. It's a lot of fun to talk to somebody, and like that. And I appreciate you reading the book. It was that means a lot to me, and hopefully people will see how much you enjoyed it and will want to join along.
Of course.
It's a fun
Great.
ride.
It was a great book. The Bosses of the Bronx. When does it come out?
March 24th is when it comes out, but it's available for pre-sale everywhere you would do that, Amazon and the like. So yeah, you can reserve a copy now, and it comes out. You'll be able to read it on Tuesday, March 24th. So
Go pick that up, everybody. Thank you.
thank you, Jason.